Welcome to our discussion on Chapter 6 from BCOM, titled Delivering Good and Neutral News Messages. Don't assume that this lecture covers everything you need to know from the textbook. You are still responsible for all the material in this chapter, but I would like to discuss some of the major points, some of the topics that will be useful to you in understanding this chapter on good and neutral news messages. First of all, we need to review the deductive communication strategy. In Chapter 4, we defined both deductive and inductive organizational patterns, and I'll remind you in this chapter that the deductive organizational pattern is where you start with the main idea and then provide details and an explanation of that main idea. So imagine you take a funnel and you turn it upside down with the small end at the top and the large end at the bottom. What you have is the main idea going into the small end, and out of the bottom end of the funnel, you have the main idea's explanations, so that lead you to the main idea. You have the details, and you have any other information that you used to come up with the initial idea at the top of the funnel. So we start with the small, the main idea, and then we break into the parts. The advantages of communicating with this kind of structure is that the first sentence is usually very easy to write. It's the main idea, it's the good news, it's the neutral news, and it's what we want to communicate. So it's easy to express. And at the beginning of our communication, it also gets the attention of the reader. And then as the reader continues, it invites the reader to discover the reasons for this main idea. So the deductive organizational structure starts with the main idea and then concludes with the details and all the reasons that the main idea was reached. In Chapter 6, we're going to look at the how and the why that we use the deductive strategy in good news messages. But first I'd like to refer to figure 6.1 on page 86 of your textbook. What I want you to recognize in this figure is that, first of all, it's a clarification of the deductive strategy. It will help you to understand the deductive strategy. And secondly, it's a statement of a clear communication strategy. We learned how to communicate from the ancient Greeks, who philosophized about a lot of areas of logic and knowledge, but one area that they discussed a great deal was communication. The Greeks told us how to communicate well, and one of their number, Plato, explained to us that good communication is like his dog. He explained that his dog has a head, it has a body, and it has a tail. And in communication, he said, we also have to have a head, a body, and a tail. And what he meant by that was an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. I like to tell students that they need to follow Plato's advice of the dog, of the introduction, the body, and the conclusion by walking Plato's dog. I say if you're walking Plato's dog, then you're using the intro, the body, and the conclusion. And so this figure 6.1 explains to us both Plato's dog and the deductive strategy, and it's a good illustration to have in mind. Now let's preview the rest of Chapter 6. We're going to talk about 5 different types of good and neutral messages that we find common in business. The first is the good news message, and this is really reduced into a single kind of good news message at this point, and that is the thank you or the appreciation message. Now I suggest to you that we don't do enough expression of appreciation and thanks for what happens to us in our lives. And to be a good manager, we really do want to communicate to our employees that we appreciate and value what they are doing. There are 3 things we need to do to make sure that a thank you note is appropriate and applicable to a situation. The first, it must be timely. It must be in a reasonable amount of time following the event that encourages the thank you note. Secondly, it must be truthful and not exaggerated. People will pick up on when something is exaggerated, and we want to be very honest and truthful in our communication. Thirdly, it must be very specific about what the reader has done. So if we can name what has happened that makes us value or appreciate what the person has done, that means even more to the person. I received a thank you note today from a student in China that I had been working with. He was very expressive of what had happened in class and how appreciative he was of it. It just made my heart warm. I encourage you to consider using thank you and appreciation notes frequently, but when you do so, be timely, be truthful, and be specific. A second kind of message discussed in the chapter is the routine claim. We'll talk later about persuasive claims in Chapter 8, but right now what we want to talk about is the routine claim. Now, if you think you are entitled to something and you ask for it, then you have made a claim. It is something that is coming to you and you make a simple request. That's called a routine claim. If you are making a claim, it may be something along the lines of a refund or an exchange or a collect on damages. I pay car insurance, and if I have a problem with my car, an accident, I have a right to go to that insurance company and to make a claim. If I purchase something from a store and something happens, it's not exactly what I want, and I go back to that store, if they have an exchange policy that says I can return something for something else, then I have a right to go to that store and to make that exchange. It's called a routine claim. Businesses like to receive routine claims. To them, it is an expression from a customer about their service that they have received, their expectations that they want, and it's best for a business to respond accordingly to that routine message with fairness and with loyalty. With fairness, because if that business owns the customer something, then they have an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, an ethical responsibility to be fair with that customer and to match that claim or to meet that claim. And by doing so, you build loyalty with that customer. So the more you work with people and meet their claims and do it fairly and respond to claim messages, the better off you are at building a loyal following and a loyal group of customers. A third type of good news or neutral news message is the routine request. And once again, there are also persuasive requests, but we'll talk about the persuasive requests in Chapter 8. Businesses see routine requests as opportunities to communicate and to build loyalty. If possible, a favorable response should be communicated appropriately and with enthusiasm. By doing so, the business says, "Thank you very much for your request. We appreciate your loyalty to us. Let us see how we can help you." A fourth type of good news messages is called the routine message of orders and credit. This is where we simply acknowledge a customer's order that has been placed with our business. And so it would be appropriate for us to send a thank you note for their order. I encourage you to read the section on extending credit, but I suggest that this is just about good communication. If you communicate well with people, you will be responding to their requests for orders and for credit. I also suggest that your own organization that you work for or eventually work for will have its own specific guidelines for offering credit. And so while you want to communicate in a proper and in a good attitude, you also want to respond in a fashion that meets the expectations and requirements and policies of your own organization. The final type of good news message that we're going to look at are procedural messages. This is where we explain a process to someone, a process or a procedure. We begin with an action step. It is the first instruction, it is the first step we expect the person to take, and so we make it clear what we expect. We want them to do something. Secondly, we need to itemize each following step clearly and specifically, so that when they begin the process, they know the following step, step by step, to reach the end of the process. Third, the textbook encourages we use a flow chart to help clarify and visualize the process for the reader. And finally, it's necessary to test your publication or your message before you send it out to whomever you're sending it. The textbook suggests that you walk through the process yourself. Does it lead you where it says it will lead you? And then secondly, it suggests that you have someone else walk through the process. They won't make the kinds of assumptions about your communication that you have made, So let someone else walk through it, and if they can do so successfully, then no doubt your work has been done correctly and will be helpful and useful to the person who is going to be reading it. In this chapter, we have talked about communicating good and neutral news with the deductive communication strategy. We also looked briefly at 5 types of good news messages. Briefly again, they are the routine orders and credit requests, routine claims, routine requests, and procedural messages. Using a good attitude and the deductive communication strategy will help your reader understand your communication and lead to more loyal customers. And you know, that's just good business. Thanks for joining me on Chapter 6.